People who grew up rich but turned out poor. What is your story? My dad owned several very successful radio stations, then sold them all for several million while all the mega media companies were buying them up. We lived very comfortably for a while with a nice house and a vacation home right on the slopes of a major Colorado ski resort. He married a gold digger. Unfortunately, he bought it all with money that relied on tech stocks. Then the dot-com bubble burst. We lost everything. He tried to sue his broker for bad advice, but only won about $200K. He then declared bankruptcy and lost everything again. Our house sold for half of its worth. I have no idea what happened to the vacation home, but I assume something similar. His wife divorced him. My dad, brother, and I all split up to try to make it on our own. He ended up couch surfing with my mom's family while he got a real estate license. He is still paying alimony. My brother and I put ourselves through school and we both have reasonable jobs now and are doing alright. I grew up rich. I wouldn't say I'm poor, but I don't live near as well as my parents. I grew up in a house which Zillow has now valued at $5 million in a very wealthy area. My mom never worked. My dad had an office and employees, and besides my mom, 3 ex-wives. My grandmother and great-grandfather came from extreme wealth. And really, it just turned out that my dad, though he was pretending for years to run a business, have an office and be a big important person, never actually made any money. All of it was drawn from a trust that had been set aside for him. And finally when it went dry, it was over. When my parents passed I inherited about $13,000. Meh, that's life. I have 2 siblings that roam the earth thinking there's still something they can capitalize on from all this. Some privileged bank of connections they can make withdrawals from. But I've accepted that I'm just ordinary folk. Life doesn't owe me anything. So fake it till you make it doesn't work. Dad went to jail for housing fraud in 2010. I was in my teens and $10 million were seized. Went from a $800,000 house to homeless in 4 days because our family didn't even know he'd been in court for 2 years. My grandparents were very wealthy, so they bought my parents a house and basically supported my family, even paying for my school tuition. I wasn't aware of this. Because of this my parents were lazy and never really had jobs. They were always at home and I didn't find any of this unusual. We had extravagant vacations and I remember being given everything I'd ever asked for. But my grandpa died when I was about 10. Grandma following suit soon after, and all his kids started fighting over the money. I'm pretty sure they're still fighting. Anyway, soon half the lights in our house didn't work. Our TVs were all broken and our cars broken down and barely usable. I was wearing the same uniform all throughout high school, and as a teenager I wore nothing but hand-me-downs. My allowance decreased instead of increased year by year. There were no more vacations. But my parents wasted the rest of their savings on appearing rich, buying fancy jewelry and clothes for themselves and racking up credit card debt. Then they'd host parties for friends in expensive restaurants and I'd feel so angry because back home we'd be eating nothing but canned food. It honestly scarred me so much that my only goal is to become financially stable, and I plan to stay employed without ever retiring because I don't want to be like them, jobless and stupid. Ironically, they've probably taught you financial responsibility really well, despite not understanding it themselves. We were really well off in Korea until we moved to America. It seemed like a piece of cake for a family like mine to start life anew with enough financial backings. My father had worked hard for his family. In the first 2 years of our life in America, my parents were scammed by shady Korean immigration lawyers twice, blew all of their savings and emergency funds. We started from rock bottom again. I remember skipping 2 meals a day so we could have food to go around everyone. I also remember pulling the plug on the refrigerator because what's the effing point if there's nothing in it? We don't look back or talk about those times anymore. Parents quit a good job cause my dad got tired of the daily repeating pattern. It bored him too much to spend his life on it. My dad was a millionaire, cheated on my mom. My mom left him. He had a mental breakdown. Lost everything, still trying to get her back 10 years later. This is a beautiful poem. Went from very well off to middle class. Grew up in Peru. My family was involved in government and acting. We appeared in a few shows. My mom was the face of a detergent brand. My sister was the face of some brand of cereal. I was doing commercials weekly. Being well off in a Latin American country was dangerous in the 90s. Still is. You have no idea. My mom had an armored car. We had shared guards with the other houses in my small block. We got followed all the time. Robbed at gunpoint. Moving to America to be safe meant losing it all and starting over. We cried in the plane. My mom even worked at Subway with my sister so we could get by. Now we live a nice secure life in Florida and I wouldn't go back. My family used to be similarly targeted by robbers. In 1980s, there was a mob group that had attacked our family and killed one of our guards. The guard was old, kind of just like a gatekeeper. He had dreams which he used to share with my dad. His dream was to make his son successful enough to own a house like our family's. He had been with our family for almost 2 decades and was like really trustworthy. A lot of people remember him. We had paid for his son's college and living. Anyway, the robbers, actually murderers, couldn't steal anything but they were later arrested and executed on orders of my granddad on charges of murder. My granddad was the judge himself. It must have been really satisfying for him to give the verdict. My dad had an oil and leather business. My dad had a stroke, and the complications from that, the medical bills, and my mother becoming his caretaker led us to eventual homelessness over the course of 5 years. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s. By the time I was 18 we had almost no assets because of medical costs. I became a teacher, and am now lower middle class and working toward middle class. My wife works for a non-profit which helps people attain financial stability. I grew up in a wealthy part of the United States, and everyone I went to school with had wealthy parents. It's amazing how many of these children are now mediocre at best and not high income earners. There was an assumption that if they simply went to college, graduated and got a job, they'd be as successful as their parents. When they weren't, they felt the world was unfair and became apathetic. My parents' neighborhood has homes in the $2 to $20 million range and about 50% of the houses now have adult children in their 50s living with 80-year-old parents. Truth. Didn't realize how wealthy we were growing up. I knew we were well off, but I definitely believed we were firmly middle class. Looking back though, if we were middle class we were the top 5%, and there is no way my dad's stepmom are middle class anymore. Although my mom might still fit the description. I don't think we were ever spoiled kids, except maybe my younger brother, as we generally followed rules, respected our parents, did chores we were asked, etc. That said, we had every game system, we all had computers, TVs in our bedrooms. Christmas always involved a lot of presents, typically with one big gift for each person, like a PS4 for my brother. Our house was a big 5-bedroom place with a pool and a built-in waterfall water slide in the suburbs. Pretty much we were well-behaved kids who as a result tended to get anything we asked for. I'm now 29, married, with a decent job, and yet I feel like I am so far away from that kind of financial affluence. We are still paying off debt from when we were in college. We rent a house, but can't afford to buy one yet. We make ends meet, but by no means keep up with any tech trends, saving for a Switch sometime next year. By contrast, my dad and stepmom own 6 properties now. Both are extremely successful in their careers. I think now I am actually middle class, and it makes the grass look a lot greener from before. I had the reverse. We grew up firmly in the middle class, perhaps even upper middle class, but because we lived in an extremely wealthy area it always felt like I was part of the poor kids group in school. It wasn't until I moved away for college that I realized that living in a 4-bedroom house, having 4 weeks of vacation per year, and your parents paying for your college tuition and books is not normal for most people. Until I was 10, my family seemed to have an ideal life. Beautiful house, in a very wealthy beachfront town, expensive cars, summer camps, and everything else a kid could want. My dad was a dentist and my mom was just starting work as real estate broker. She said her money was fun money. Dad paid the bills, but, unbeknownst to us, Dad didn't pay the bills. He was living a double life with our babysitter. They even had their own house. My parents split and weeks later, the bank took our house. We, my mom and us 3 kids, were out on our ass. My dad has taken whatever was left of the money, not much, and destroyed my mom's credit with bankruptcies and delinquencies she didn't know about. We struggled for many years and had lots of help from family friends. There were many birthdays and holidays with no gifts and lots of pasta for dinner. My mom could stretch a dollar pretty well since she had grown up with not much money. Now, 30 years later, my mom has become successful financially through lots of hard work. My dad is still with my old babysitter. He retired. He was forced to sell his practice because of lots of bad business practices, and is now working a minimum wage job and living in near poverty. Calm as a bee. Well, not exactly rich, but my family was making a fair sum when I was a kid. Then there were mass layoffs and now we live paycheck to paycheck. It's not that we don't make enough money, it's just that my parents, with all the respect, are financial imbeciles. On the bright side, seeing them as an example of what not to do, I learned everything there is to learn about personal finance and a fair bit about business. On the stupid side, I've repeatedly explained to my parents all the necessary steps for them to get out of their financial problems, but as my mom put it, if I can't spend my money then what's the point in even working? Like, seriously woman, you can spend your money but not effing all of it. Not me, but my ex. Her family owned a retail business and was fairly wealthy. At some point I think the number I was given was about $30 mil. I repeatedly suggested that they set some money aside. I'm not an expert, but small businesses can go under in the blink of an eye, and it just made sense that they put away some savings just in case. Every time I brought it up I was told that I was being stupid and that real business owners don't save anything. They invest all of their earnings back into their business. Eventually I stopped bringing it up so they'd stop making me feel like sh for being concerned. And eventually after that our relationship ended. Last I spoke to her they were in the process of losing everything. The rise of online retail had absolutely ruined them. Grew up rich in Pakistan until my mother got ill and made a string of bad choices in her business. Her business partner took off with the money, went from rich to homeless. Luckily my father still had his well-paying job, so we could slowly start to rebuild. There was a lot of loan to pay back, which my father and mother managed. Mother started from scratch again. Whereas I moved out to Germany on a loan from friends to study further, and currently am doing my PhD, which doesn't really pay much, but to be honest I don't care as long as it is enough to feed me and I get to do what I love. My dad had a midlife crisis when I was in high school and left his family and job to move across the country to marry his lover. He still helped pay for some of our college, still graduated with debt, but no emotional support, no connections, no leg up on anything. After such an a-hole move I don't know if I could possibly have accepted any of that from him anyways. I am probably a little better off than most still, but I don't live in a 15,000 square ft house like I grew up in. I was born into what pretty much was poverty in Eastern Russia, moved to Australia with my mum where she met and married my dad. They started a business when I was about 9 or 10 which took off, and I clearly remember suddenly having a lot more nice food. For example, mum started buying bread from the bakery and no longer bought those plastic cheese squares. I also was suddenly signed up for art and dance classes. They bought a bigger apartment around this time and sent me to an expensive private school while continuing with the extracurricular activities. I remember mum kept trying to take me shopping, which I always refused because when I was little we never bought anything, so I felt bad asking for things. Then dad lost his business and mum's business also took a hit, so they went from both incomes to essentially half of hers. I was living in uni at this time, so I was definitely a student and living on a budget, but a main thing I noticed was how stressed they had become and how they no longer had dinner parties. They are doing better now, but I would say they are more middle class. I think it affected my younger brothers more since they grew up during the wealthy period, while I still remember mum not being able to afford things like grapes and yogurt. I'm currently 20 and in university. My family isn't stupid wealthy like owning mansions or yachts or anything. We have a nice 4-bedroom house in the suburbs and we live comfortably. I often worry that I won't find a job that pays as well as my parents and that I will spend most of my life living in lower quality conditions than my parents. Many people would be fine with that, but my parents raised me with the ideology that I should be a better and more successful person than them. I feel like if I don't get a job that puts me at least on par with them, I will feel like I have failed and that my efforts were futile.